Hello, and welcome to this week's sermon. This is a sermon for the 23rd of November 2025, and that will be the last Sunday before Advent, Year C. And I'm using the second set of readings, which are First Book of Samuel, chapter 8, verses 4 to 20, Psalm 72, verses 1 to 7, and John's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 33 to 37. The Israelites demanded a king. Why? What had provoked this request? Well, their motivation came after Samuel's sons had proven to be such a disappointment. We are told that they wanted to be like other nations around them. But what gain did they see from adopting a monarchy? Well, up to this point, the Israelites had lived as a theocracy. God was nominally in charge of the nation, and his will was conveyed by priests. When Samuel's sons proved unworthy, they opted for a hereditary monarchy to be in charge instead of a hereditary priesthood. One big difference is in the style of leadership a monarchy would entail. Whereas there could be a group of priests in power, Samuel's two sons, for example, a monarch would be a single unifying figure who would bring in political stability and a greater sense of nationhood. Up to this point, the Jews had lived as a loose federation of tribes based on the 12 sons of Jacob. Each tribe was led by charismatic individuals called the judges. But there was no central civil power outside of the priesthood. This form of government is known as an amphictyonic league. And if you can spell amphictyonic, you're not doing bad. Both ancient Greece and Israel organized themselves for a while on this basis. It is the form of living together but separately, and it is inherently less stable than being one nation. So this is one of the advantages of monarchy, a greater sense of nationhood because a diverse populace identifies with one unifying figure. Whether Samuel was motivated to try to defend the status quo and keep the priests in charge, I cannot say, but Samuel points out the downside of all earthly potentates. And although Samuel was addressing the pros and cons of absolute monarchy, we would add that elected presidents can fall prey to many of the things Samuel says of absolute monarchs. I'm not thinking of any individuals at all, honestly. The chief fear is that the monarch usurps God's authority over the people and uses them as slaves for his own purposes, acting as though they were there to serve him rather than he is there to serve them. These fears have been proven manifestly true of absolute monarchs and elected heads of governments throughout history. It goes without saying that those who seized power by force used the populace for their own political ends. But leaders, whether monarchs, presidents or dictators, have always picked fights for other people to fight, and also taken their goods in tax to pay for the privilege. What benefit did most foot soldiers stand to get by risking their lives? None in many cases. One minor exception, however, from my own family tree would be John Hogarth, who was made freeman of the city of York in 1461 after the Battle of Towton, the biggest battle in history on British soil, which took place during the War of the Roses. My wife's evil Lancastrian hordes were defeated by those brave, upright citizens of York. 75,000 fought at Towton Moor on the 29th of March 1461, and 28,000 died that day. What had those 28,000 ever stood to get out of this royal feud? Zilch, as far as I can see. Samuel was fearful of creating similarly unbridled power. Samuel was addressing the pros and cons of absolute monarchy, in which the king holds all the power, unfettered by any parliament. In holding power as a priestly oligarchy, power was dispersed, but placing power in the hands of an individual was asking for trouble, in Samuel's opinion. And this is particularly a danger inherent in the Israelites' campaign for a monarch. It was a generally held belief at the time that only God could confer royal authority. Kings exercise power on God's behalf. This is the source of the belief in the divine succession of kings, a theme that still features in modern coronation rites. Charles, by the grace of God, etc., etc. Israel's king came from the bottom up, from the people's demand, and not from their God making his will known via the priesthood that a king was required. In effect, it was a popular uprising against the priesthood after the dismal showing of Samuel's sons. The people wanted to be like the other nations around them, which was contrary to their special calling to be a unique community with a unique purpose. The people preferred a human king to their divine overlord. It was their initiative rather than God's. Perhaps the seeds of their later problems were sown at the very beginning. The fact that Psalm 72 opens with a plea for the king to be like all the things we would normally ascribe to be God's attributes suggests that having a human king had been a letdown. Psalm 72 may have been an enthronement psalm, expressing ideals for a new monarch's reign. But it reads as a plaintive supplication out of that context. For the dreams of Psalm 72 have never been fulfilled. We have never known unadulterated competence, wisdom, and goodness in any leader. We have had some good, pious leaders over time, but all have had feet of clay. None have been without questionable opinions or dubious decisions to their name. Psalm 72 reminds me of ministers' induction services, or even ordination service, when we implore God to endow the new minister with all the ideal attributes which a minister is meant to have. It is the triumph of hope over experience. But perhaps this just shows again, as in the biblical narrative, that human beings can never live up to the ideals we invest in them. All leaders are perhaps doomed to fail in time. Can you think of any past hero who was lauded in their day, who still retains an unsullied reputation for some misdemeanor or wrongful attitude today? There is a widespread sense across the world at the moment that the leaders we have are unable to address the challenges we face. Few leaders, either those democratically elected or even those in one-party states, can count on widespread support. Today's problems are so gargantuan that we desperately crave leaders who will face up to global debt, bankrupt state pension schemes, geopolitical bullies, environmental challenges, and crashing population profiles. As people see the looming problems ever more clearly, so the world at large is throwing out established parties who have failed us in the past in search of new faces and new ideas. That sense of desperation can lead to monumental trouble, as history teaches us. Yet when God offered the world such a king, and the offer is still open in Jesus, we find that people don't really want that after all. They prefer their own ways because they are dark, in St. John's words, and people prefer to shun the light. What we say we want does not match with what we actually choose. Our political and economic failings are not just cases of poor judgment or broken systems. Our situation is a product of our moral choices, our religious choices, if you will, in the broadest sense, which is the message the Old Testament prophets were trying to get across. The fact that what Amos, Hosea, Zephaniah and the rest said to their contemporaries about injustice can still be applied to so many instances today rather suggests that we have not made much progress. Yet the Israelites got their king. Despite Samuel's warning, God allowed them the freedom to make a bad decision. The people were about to go astray, just as Samuel's sons went astray. Their remedy improved nothing very much and risked making things much worse. But God allowed them to make that decision anyway, because that is the price of love. Love allows mistakes to be made. Love may offer advice. Love might offer an alternative. But love, in the end, gives way and respects the freedom of the other to act as they see fit. Because the alternative to permitting an error being made is to coerce the other, dominate and control the other. So, love relents and allows the world to go its own way. But love doesn't step back and give up. God still uses our bad decisions for our good whenever people cooperate with him. Out of our chaos, God seeks to bring healing and order. Over the years, there were some reasonably good kings of Israel and Judah, but there were also some absolute horrors. But the good news is that God redeemed the world at a time of one of their very worst incumbents on the throne, Herod the Great. And the Redeemer was the truly greatest child of all the Davidic line, Jesus. As we survey the crumbling, troubled world of our era, we can take comfort that however great the mess we are in, God is at work to rescue and redeem us. Sometimes it feels as if we don't know where the next crisis is coming from. But God's reply is, no, you don't. And you don't know where the next solution is coming from either. Amen.